In 2020, when the George Floyd protests became a summer season of riots, the American media, particularly at CNN, this is where it happened. I think it was Ali Velshi at the time, who's a progressive from Al Jazeera and MSNBC and the like. He described the protest, I think it was him, described the protests as fiery but mostly peaceful. Fiery but mostly peaceful. Well, there's a problem. Polling has come out. And the polling shows that something like 49% of Americans are opposed to what's happening. 49% of Americans are opposed to what's happening with the protests. Only 20% support. It's a pretty big deal. 49% oppose, only 20% support. And in fact, if you were to force the people who are completely undecided how they stand, a majority of them say they think they're opposed. This is turning bad for Joe Biden. Columbia University has now canceled its graduation. Imagine that you work your butt off for college. You work your butt off. You're looking forward to graduation, and the hecklers get the veto. That's what's happened at Columbia. It's given Donald Trump some fodder.
Now, it just came out, Columbia just canceled their commencement. Axios. Columbia just canceled their commencement. That shouldn't happen. And it also came out that the protesters, many of the protesters, are backed by Biden's donors. Okay? Are you listening, Israel? I hope you're listening, Israel. Hope you're getting smart. But they're backed by Biden donors. That's where the money's coming from. And I'm not surprised at all.
Yeah, look, it's telling the truth. It is Biden donors have funded these protests. And isn't it remarkable that the word comes that Biden, his donors have funded the protesters who've turned violent on these college campuses. And now suddenly it's, well, they're mostly peaceful. And in fact, in 2020, what happened was some outside group produced a report that said 95% of the protests have been peaceful. And the media ate it up and ran the headline, 95% according to an independent, nonpartisan research study. And now it's 99%, probably from the same left-wing research group saying the same thing. Over at MSNBC, they have picked this mantle up to make sure everyone knows these are mostly peaceful.
Jeet, I'll start with you and your reading of these mostly peaceful protests and how they have been covered by our media and how they've been described by pundits in the media. Why does the focus seem to be on the spectacle rather than the actual substance of what is behind these protests?
Well, I think the two things go together that you brought up, which is the actual violence in Gaza, and I would add the West Bank, and the hysteria about the protest. That the same media that wants to ignore what is happening, the mass slaughter of civilians, also wants to denigrate and lie about the protesters. And it's really remarkable. I'll add beyond peaceful. Like, if you actually talk to the protesters and engage with the movement and go to some protests, as I have up here in Canada, it's an incredibly inspiring movement. It is one of the most multicultural movements that has ever existed in the United States. You see people of all shades and colors from all around the world united by their outrage at what is happening in Gaza.
United in their outrage. Did you catch that? Did you catch that? If you go to one of these protests, like I did in Canada, he hasn't even been to these college campus protests. But don't you get that? The fringe, they're on the outside. We heard a professor on CNN last week say the fringe, they're not actually spewing anti-Semitic stuff inside the Columbia Square there in the tent village. They're not seeing yet. Don't believe your lying eyes. Yes, there was. It was remarkable. So the spin is on from the left that you actually, you can't believe your eyes, that these are mostly peaceful. It's outsiders and troublemakers. Ro Khanna, one of the most progressive members of Congress.
I mean, you can't be shouting guillotine, guillotine. You can't be shouting globalize the intifada or Zionists don't deserve to live. What's being lost is that those few protesters who are inciting violence or engaging in that kind of anti-Semitism are diminishing the thousands of young people who simply want the war to end. And I guess I would say look to John Lewis or Dr. King. They, in their protests, were above reproach. If some individual engaged in bigotry, they call them out first and loudly. So I'm proud of a lot of the young people who want to end the war, but they need to show the discipline. And some universities have. Look at Cornell, look at University of Minnesota, look at what's happening at Northwestern. There have been efforts not to have the police in, to have dialogue with the student protesters, to have much more peace and calm. And there are models for what can work in this country.
There are models. Even he. Oh, get away from the anti-Semitism, please. Get away from there. The Democrats using the Sunday shows to try to push the protesters in the direction to go. Ron Brownstein was on CNN talking about some of the political implications of this for Biden and the crack up within the Democratic Party that the protests are causing.
So far, which is to say that protest is, perfectly American. It's sort of in our DNA, but there are excesses, and it can't veer into violence. It should not veer into anti-Semitism. It certainly should not veer into anti-Americanism. He's trying to hold what Arthur Schlesinger once called the vital center on this issue. And as I said, I actually think on the issue of protest itself, he is probably in a pretty safe position politically. The problem is affirming that position is just kind of salt in the wound for those younger voters who are alienated on him about the war. Ultimately, I think his policy toward the war is the real issue here. And the question of whether he can repair the breaches in the Democratic coalition over that, I think, is in the long run going to be more important than kind of finding a relatively defensible centrist position on the protest itself.
A relatively centrist position on the protest itself, less important to do that. Now, why? Why is all this happening? One more piece of audio for you. David Brooks was on PBS over the weekend. David Brooks of the New York Times, they're one of their centrist voices. Listen to this.
President running against the protest. It's not so much the message of the protest, it's the violence that surrounds them. I'm teaching at the University of Chicago this term, and a couple hundred yards from here, the encampment at our school is there, and the university had a very clear policy. We celebrate your right to express your point of view, but we don't allow you to make the campus violent. We're not going to let you disrupt campus. We're not going to allow you to disrupt learning. And today, the president, Paul Lasavados, sent out an email to everybody in the community saying, we celebrate the right to make your statements. Unfortunately, the students have been disruptive. They've torn down Israeli signs. They've silenced speakers. They've made the campus. They've interfered with learning in the campus. And so he sent out a somewhat ominous email. And I have to say, things are pretty tame here compared to a lot of the other places. So what Americans support is free speech. What they don't support is what looks like anarchy. And so I think if the protests continue to veer in the direction they're veering, you could see some pretty serious repercussions, which is why Biden is speaking, which is why Chuck Schumer is speaking, trying to distance himself from what the protesters are doing.
Serious repercussions. That would be Donald Trump getting reelected. Notice the point that David Brooks makes at the beginning. Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan both got elected as the middle class responded to left-wing protests gone awry and reacted by moving to the right. That's why we're suddenly seeing all of this concern about the protests and all of this spin that don't believe your eyes, everything is fine, everything is fine. Everything is not fine when this is happening. Everything is not fine on the Democratic side when suddenly it looks like Donald Trump has something else to run on. And by the way, Republicans are starting ads on this. I had a couple people text me over the last few days, said, where are the Republican ads on this? They're coming. I've seen some of them, including in Las Vegas. There are some ads that are going to be out there tying the Democrats to this. In fact, one of the things Joe Biden has done that, if you recall, the Democrats turned on the GOP in 2020 is when Donald Trump and others said all lives matter in response to Black Lives Matter. The Democrats scream, but it's not everybody under attack right now. It's not everybody under assault right now. It's only black people. And so you've got to say Black Lives Matter. And there were people who were coming out and saying, hey, look, I get the sentiment, but yeah, this is what's going on right now. And this is why people are saying Black Lives Matter. And what is Joe Biden doing right now? saying, I condemn the anti-Semitism and the Islamophobia because all lives matter, clearly revealing that it was Democratic opportunism in 2020 to yell at people saying all lives matter. A reactionary response by the right saying all lives matter provoked a counter-reactionary response from the left and the media about, well, that's not what's going on right now. But notice the media is not out there telling the Democrats right now, hey, Islamophobia isn't the issue right now. The issue is these campus protesters screaming death to the Jews. And the public has seen enough of it. The public has seen so much, public opinion has turned decisively against the protests. And so now the Democrats are in damage control. So I need to paint the broader picture for you here. That's the most important part of this. For months now, because this isn't new. This is only like we've entered the summer riot season for the left. But since October 8th, the day after the Hamas attack, you started seeing anti-Semitism rear its head on college campuses. For all the lecturing about the right and the tiki torch whites and the racism and the white nationalism and the anti-Semitism of the right, October 8th was a defining moment. You had people coming out cheering Hamas on college campuses. You had Jews at the school in New York that were locked in the library. You had students at MIT and Columbia and Harvard, Jewish students who were harassed in their dorms and on campus. You've had screams about globalize the Intifada, which is a call for attacks on Jews. You've had cheers of Palestine will be free from river to sea, another genocidal call against Jews. You've had all of that since October 8th. But these college campus protests have turned violent in the last couple of weeks, and the polling has shifted dramatically. Since the protesters got violent, the polling shifted, and only now that the polling shifted are Democrats upset about these nasty anti-Semites on campus. Your lesson is very simple. Democrats are perfectly fine being a party full of anti-Semites until it affects their polling. Again, like with Joe Biden being forced to finally come out and condemn anti-Semitism, and even then he both sided it with also Islamophobia, Democrats refuse to do the right thing until polling tells them they must.